all the Honors College faculty for the work they put into this, as well as Julia Gunter, one of our staff who's really done a lot to organize the hospitality for these events. And I'd, of course, like to thank the Jack Miller Center for their generous sponsorship on this conference. I'd like to thank all of you who are here for being here and for doing the reading. I've been, not leading one seminar, but moving from one seminar to another and listening. And it's really been great to just hear. I've been thinking about O'Connor for a long time, but it's good for me to sit back and listen and hear people who are encountering her for the first time, to hear how different generations are responding to O'Connor. Also, it's nice, as an English professor, so it's hard to give a talk when people haven't done the reading. To get up and talk about an author when people haven't actually read the fiction. So I'm delighted at this opportunity. I'd also like to thank Jerome for yesterday's talk, which I thought was both a great general introduction to O'Connor and an overview of her relation to major political thinkers such as Tocqueville, whom I will mention once or twice myself. But my title is a clue that my own approach to this topic is, of course, that of a literary scholar rather than a political philosopher. My phrase, tradition in the individual American, is a play on the title of T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition in the Individual Talent. Eliot himself being an American-born poet, though we often think of him as British. In this influential essay, written a century ago, Eliot observed that English-speaking people not infrequently use the word traditional with negative connotations. When it comes to the arts in particular, Eliot says, we in the Anglosphere tend to favor individual talent. That is, artists who seem to be entirely innovative, to break with tradition. Eliot thinks that this is a mistake. Individual talent is important, of course, as is innovation. The best artists, however, not only have such talent, but also see themselves as part of a living tradition, always in dialogue with those who have come before them. No poet, no artist of any art, Eliot says, has his complete meaning alone, but must be read in relation to the dead, the poets and artists who have come before him. The very best sort of modern Western writer, Eliot says, writes with an awareness that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and a dialogic relationship with his own. Flannery O'Connor would agree. And while her stories at times indeed draw on Greek myth, Dante, and other European sources, I want to focus today on how she wrote herself into the literature of her own country, how she understood her relationship to American literary tradition, and perhaps the American experiment more broadly. Simple as it may seem, this topic can easily be overlooked. On the one hand, O'Connor is often quickly labeled a regional writer, a Southern writer. On the other hand, she is often properly as a committed Catholic writer. So O'Connor is sometimes labeled a regional writer, sometimes, and properly, recognized as a Catholic writer, and can thereby seem entirely out of place not only in the South, but in the entire American literary tradition, which before her is almost entirely devoid of notable Catholic writers. We know from O'Connor's essay, The Fiction Writer in His Country, that O'Connor herself believed that she could and should be at once a Southern writer, an American writer, and, most importantly, a Catholic writer whose true country transcended national borders. In that essay, she is directly addressing her relationship to contemporary American literature circa 1960. Elsewhere in her writing, in her nonfiction, O'Connor made very clear that she saw herself as belonging to a national literary tradition that included earlier figures ranging from Edgar Allan Poe and Henry James to Mark Twain and Joel Chandler Harris. Most consistently, she articulated her place in this national tradition in relation to one particular author, Nathaniel Hawthorne. She did so not only in her essay, Introduction to a Memoir of Mary Ann, which we read for today, but also in other essays and letters, where O'Connor said that she felt, quote, more of a kinship with Hawthorne than with any other American writer. I am, she wrote, one of his descendants. It is curious that this devout Roman Catholic from Georgia, writing in the aftermath of World War II, should feel such kinship with the New Englander who wrote just before the Civil War. Furthermore, Hawthorne, unlike O'Connor, was best known for writing historical fiction, often set almost 2 centuries before his own lifetime. The Scarlet Letter, for example, was published in 1850, but is set in the 1640s, in the colonial era. Hawthorne's ancestors were Puritans, one a judge in the Salem witch trial, and in writing, he in effect wrote about the earliest American Bible Belt. Don't know how to, I think if I tug on this thing a little bit in the right direction, it seems to keep working. Hawthorne, in effect, wrote about the earliest American Bible Belt in Massachusetts. By the time O'Connor was writing, the Bible Belt had clearly moved further south. O'Connor understood, though, that Hawthorne was ultimately writing not only about a regional identity, but about an emerging American identity. And he often tied that identity, critically, to the stories of individuals who break with tradition. These characters are not individual artists or talents, generally, such as Eliot wrote of, but simply individuals. And they, paradoxically, establish an American tradition of rebelling against tradition, and they, as Puritans, do so in a specifically anti-Catholic milieu. This is crystal clear in 2 Hawthorne stories that I will attend to briefly here, beginning with one of his best-known, Young Goodman Brown. First, it's important to understand who the New England Puritans were. To oversimplify, they were Calvinist Protestants who dissented from the established Church of England and who believed that the Church of England was still too Catholic, with its bishops, its liturgies, its statues and images, etc. New England Puritans were on the whole more radical than the ones who stayed in Old England. To varying degrees, they gave up on England. Put positively, they came to North America seeking freedom to worship God as they thought proper and to establish a city on a hill, something like a Christian utopia. Put negatively, they tended to a kind of paranoia as they saw themselves surrounded by evil on all sides, by Catholics in Europe, by semi-Catholics in England itself, by native heathens in America, some influenced by French Catholic missionaries before the Puritans got here. Whereas Catholics and Anglicans saw themselves in a continuous Christian tradition, the New England Puritans largely saw themselves as breaking with a millennium or more of corrupt Christendom in order to practice a newly purified Christianity. They did put great stock in their own smaller communities, of course. Relatedly, they didn't approve of other dissenting Protestants, like the Quakers. But Hawthorne saw the Puritan experiment as often fostering a kind of moralistic individualism that outlasted the Puritans themselves and that O'Connor was very much attuned to in later American culture. The Hawthorne story that encapsulates this pattern most concisely is Young Goodman Brown, which is set in Salem, Massachusetts, circa 1690. Here, the young protagonist mysteriously decides to accompany the devil into the woods. For just one night, he thinks, only to find that everyone else in his community has seemingly beat him there, including those who taught him his catechism. Brown, in a strange visionary moment, witnesses them all gathered together, and the devil convinces him that none of them are pure, a conviction which thereafter leads Brown to completely withdraw from his neighbors for the rest of his life. Crucially, the devil's leading Brown to distrust his present community is preceded by leading him to distrust a community that reaches back in time, Brown's ancestors. When he first appears, the devil strangely resembles Brown's father, and as if in reaction, Brown exclaims, "My father never went into the woods on such an errand, nor his father before him. We have been a race of honest men and good Christians since the days of the martyrs," by which he means the days of Queen Mary or Bloody Mary a century previous. But the devil tells Brown that he is mistaken. Young Goodman Brown, I have been as well acquainted with your family as with ever a one among the Puritans, and that's no trifle to say. I helped your grandfather, the constable, when he lashed the Quaker woman so smartly through the streets of Salem. And it was I that brought your father a pitch pine knot, kindled at my own hearth, to set fire to an Indian village in King Philip's War. They were my good friends both. Here the devil refers to actual historical events which Hawthorne's own ancestors had participated in, and which Hawthorne himself recognized as reprehensible. Hawthorne knew, and wants his reader to know, that no earthly family or community is without blemish. Yet the devil achieves his great victory in this story by linking this knowledge to a kind of separatist impulse. Brown resists him near the end, but in fact the devil has already achieved his real goal simply by convincing him that everyone else is under his sway. As the narrator tells us, to be baptized by the devil is to become, quote, more conscious of the secret guilt of others, both in deed and thought, than of one's own, end quote. At the end of the story, Brown has nowhere to go but back to his village, yet he becomes a kind of recluse, even within his own family. The irony here is that in moving away from his Puritan neighbors, if only internally, young Goodman Brown becomes, in a sense, the perfect Puritan. He is completely alone, apparently aware of his need to embody a kind of righteousness, but it is a righteousness that can no longer be grounded in anything other than the self. The devil has achieved something like what Tocqueville says democracy in America tends towards, as it fosters an individualism that, quote, not only makes, this is Tocqueville, an individualism that, quote, not only makes every man forget his ancestors, but it hides his descendants and separates his contemporaries from him. It throws him back forever upon himself alone and threatens in the end to confine him entirely within the solitude of his own heart. The story Young Goodman Brown then demonstrates how Hawthorne tended to emphasize a particularly moralistic individualism, a solipsistic self-righteousness, as a regrettable corollary to a Puritan heritage. In this story, Hawthorne himself is not so explicit as I have just been in linking colonial New England to the later United States. But Hawthorne could be in other stories, and I will quickly highlight just one, Endicott and the Red Cross. This story is based on an actual event in 1634 in which fear that an increasingly popish monarchy will tyrannize Massachusetts leads Governor John Endicott to cut St. George's Cross from the English flag. So this is not the Union Jack. This is the flag of England, white with a red cross in the middle of it. Hawthorne depicts Endicott rending the cross from the flag with his sword and proudly proclaiming that, quote, neither pope nor tyrant has sway over New England now. The Puritans thereby end with a ragged cloth of pure whiteness in an isolated society that is depicted in this story not as a Christian utopia, but instead as a nightmare of violence against nature and neighbor, of merciless judgment and public shaming. Writing in 1837, Hawthorne, as narrator, clearly states that Endicott's rebellion in some ways foreshadows the American Revolution. Quote, we, in 1837, look back through the mist of ages and recognize in the rending of the Red Cross from New England's banner the first omen of that deliverance which our fathers consummated after the bones of the stern Puritan had lain more than a century in the dust. This deliverance is ultimately noted with irony, however, as on the deepest level, Hawthorne implies that American Christianity and American society may be lacking in part because of severed connections to older traditions. O'Connor was attuned to all these aspects of Hawthorne's work because she was a Catholic surrounded by Georgia Protestants who at times expressed explicitly anti-Catholic convictions of their own, and because she lived in an era when many Americans, even outside the South, still openly questioned whether Catholics were capable of being good U.S. citizens. I'm about to consider this with regard to her stories we've been reading together, but before I do so, I have to call attention to one last aspect of Hawthorne's work that O'Connor surely recognized: his fixation on color. Put simply, Hawthorne's Puritan characters generally want to live in a world of black and white. In part, this is a manifestation of the fact that they are people of the book and the unillustrated book only. Black words printed plainly on a white page. No illuminated manuscripts for the Puritans. All those colors would just distract the reader from the saving text. They distrusted stained glass windows, statues of saints, crucifixes, sometimes even red crosses, and banned them from their places of worship. But their fixation on thinking in black and white manifests itself figuratively as well, as thinking in dichotomous extremes. At least in Hawthorne, young Goodman Brown thought his family and community was completely pure and innocent. The devil convinces him that they are entirely corrupt and guilty. What's the real truth about the Brown family, and to some extent every family or community? It's neither black nor white, but brown. We can acknowledge this without being relativist. From any Christian perspective, one should of course seek to be pure of heart, but one should also simultaneously recognize one's own sinful tendency and ongoing need for forgiveness. And in viewing others, avoid simply and irrevocably placing them in the category of the damned. Hawthorne's Puritans have trouble with this. Each yearns, am I okay here? Yep. Each yearns to live in a world that is almost Edenic, to be Adam before the fall. Yet each tends to keep seeing others as totally depraved, and thereby to embrace the devil's vision, this is from young Goodman Brown, of, quote, the whole earth is one stain of guilt, one mighty blood spot. For many of Hawthorne's characters, it's one extreme or the other. The author himself, of course, knew the truth to be more complex and worked towards it in characters like Hester Prynne, whose scarlet letter A is meant by the Puritans to mark her simply as an idea, as adultery personified. But Hester, who strangely resembles a nun at points in the novel, keeps embroidering it so that it becomes less a letter than a work of art. And its scarlet letter should finally be associated less with the blood spot of guilt that Brown's devil spoke of than with the traditional red cross, which Endicott could not accept. The red cross is, of course, the answer to the stain of our guilt. Christ's bodily suffering, the answer to Adam's sin of pride. Accepting this entails thinking in color, as it were, and with an attentiveness to an embodied God who enters into our tainted history to redeem it. An attentiveness that can be lessened by living only in one's head with neatly delineated but ultimately abstract concepts of good and evil. All of this prepares us to consider the O'Connor story, and I'm going to try and go through the three stories we've already read, but also set up some more questions for the displaced person with all this. All of what I've just said prepares us to consider the O'Connor story that perhaps most obviously demonstrates her kinship to Hawthorne, Parker's Back. Here, the character Sarah Ruth is not literally a New England Puritan, but she is a Southern version of one. Sarah Ruth is the daughter of a straight gospel preacher, and despite her intensely professed faith, she won't get married in a church because she thinks that churches are idolatrous. Like the Puritans, she might consent to entering a meeting house, but not a church. In teaching this story, I often ask students, where does Sarah Ruth think that God can be found? Maybe at her house, some say, because she seems to never want to leave it. I think the best answer is Sarah Ruth would say that God could be found in the Bible, but even more so, she believes that God can be found in her head, and her head only, while she is reading the Bible. He apparently cannot be found anywhere else on earth, not in any church building or community, nowhere even in his own creation. He's a spirit, she says, no man shall see his face. And her failure to see other human beings, particularly her husband, as actually being made in the image of God is at the heart of the story. She is obsessed with salvation, but never seems to believe that anyone else, particularly Parker, is saved. Sarah Ruth clearly reduces religious practice to a kind of moralism or legalism that is rooted in self-selected portions of the Old Testament, and she makes herself the sole judge, jury, and enforcer when it comes to applying them. She's not only a self-righteous individualist, but a vigilante, in effect. And her preference for seeing things in black and white is on full display as she constantly vents her anger against Parker. It is, of course, surprising that she has married him, her being against color as she is. Parker may well be right in his suspicion that on some hidden level, she actually liked everything that she said she didn't. The lonely self-righteousness she favors, like that of young Goodman Brown at the end of his story, is not only theologically problematic, it's also simply unnatural. In Sarah Ruth's case, she initially sees her resistance to the color on Parker's skin as resistance to a heathen practice. His tattoos are, she says, quote, no better than what a fool Indian would do, end quote. Like Hawthorne's Puritans, Sarah Ruth is a kind of isolationist, and her lonely city on a hill is apparently her own house. Parker, in effect, brings the larger world home to her in his body via the tattoos, most of which, he tells us, he got not in the US, but in foreign parts. Now, Parker himself is, as the saying goes, kind of a mess, literally and figuratively. He has a hunger for the beauty in the world that his wife denies, but hasn't generally been interested in goodness or truth. Things begin to change for the better when Parker, in a sincere, if poorly judged attempt to give something to his wife, has a Byzantine Christ tattooed on his last remaining canvas, his back. Then he speaks his given name, Obadiah, servant of God, and all the images from across the world that seem to have become part of his soul as well as his body are transformed into, quote, a perfect arabesque of colors, a garden overseen by the eyes of Christ. But this Christ appears foreign, indeed unrecognizable to Sarah Ruth, contaminating the purity of her house. Parker seems even worse to her than when he was a heathen, precisely because he has become so close to her. Idolatry, she screams. She would rip the Byzantine Christ from his flesh if she could, just as Endicott ripped the Red Cross. But as it is, she beats her husband until large welts had formed on the face of the tattooed Christ. As always, there's much more that could be said about this story. The last thing I'll say about it for now is that whereas Endicott seems primarily worried about separation of church and state, or something like that, Hawthorne and O'Connor are more fundamentally concerned with separation of church and the arts. To different degrees, both would agree with T.S. Eliot that a church which doesn't foster the arts and/or artists who have no sense of church whatsoever ultimately diminishes and tends to separate us all. The second story that we read, Everything That Rises Must Converge, is in fact about a prospective artist. Not a visual artist, but the aspiring writer, Julian. One way to read this story is in terms of competing narratives. That is, the story Julian would like to write versus the real story that is actually told by O'Connor. It's entirely written in third person, of course, but O'Connor's narrative voice conveys Julian's thoughts to us in no other characters, with varying degrees of detachment and irony throughout. The Julian that we meet at the beginning of this story is in many ways similar to the young Goodman Brown that we meet at the end of that story. O'Connor's focus is tighter than Hawthorne's, though, as Julian's extended family and tradition are to him represented almost entirely by one person, his mother. At the beginning of the story, Julian has already concluded that his family and tradition are entirely corrupt, and he does what he can to withdraw from them into the inner compartment of his mind, the solitude of his own heart, Tocqueville might say, where he can believe that he is separate from his family and morally innocent. Paradoxically, he does view his mother as, quote, innocent and untouched by experience early in the story. But he absolutely does not view her as morally innocent. He correctly views her as guilty of racial prejudice and more generally of dwelling only in the past. He therefore views her as innocent only in the sense of being naive and childlike, trusting blindly in traditions that were passed down to her by her parents. To be innocent in this sense, as Julian sees it, is to be guilty. He sees himself, by contrast, as an adult, and therefore as independent, autonomous, self-controlled, and we see very clearly self-righteous. He is less overtly violent than Sarah Ruth, but he too becomes a kind of vigilante, trying to punish his mother for her moral impurity. In the story that he wants to write, he is the individualist hero, and she is the traditionalist villain. There are, of course, further complexities and paradoxes here. Julian does theoretically want to align himself with an African-American community of some kind, but he is manifestly incapable of envisioning any such community or any individuals within it. He sees them only abstractly, as types, and he wants to write them as mere pawns in his battle against his mother. In his version of this story, it is two different races that are converging, and he wants his mother to feel crushed by the convergence. In O'Connor's version, Julian is much more closely tied to his mother than he is aware of, and he must recognize how his identity is bound up with hers, how they converge, if he is to grow. While he wishes to ascribe all guilt for white supremacy to his mother and her predecessors, and to envision himself as radically innocent, he also has moments where he secretly, almost unconsciously, desires the leisure that slavery had afforded his slave-owning forebears, who lived in a mansion. Quote, "He never spoke of the mansion without contempt or thought of it without longing. It remained in his mind as his mother had known it. It appeared in his dreams regularly. He would stand on the wide porch, listening to the rustle of old oak leaves, wander through the high-ceilinged hall into the parlor that opened onto it. It occurred to him that it was he, not his mother, who could have appreciated it," he thinks, because presumably he would have gotten some writing done there. Julian's general desire to radically distance himself from his ancestors has made him fail to see how much he resembles them. His narcissistic failure to recognize and interpret his own place in a larger history is in part what dooms him to unwittingly echo their dehumanization of African Americans in the present. Only at the story's end is Julian, for the first time, on the verge of confronting not his individual moral innocence, but rather his guilt, as he prepares to enter the world of guilt and sorrow, to recognize his complicity both in causing his mother's death from a stroke and in the condescending habits of racial categorization that he strangely shares with the ancestors he has tried to separate himself from. It's worth noting that Everything That Rises Must Converge is one of the few major O'Connor stories which is almost entirely devoid of religious reference or context. The tradition that Julian and his mother struggle over here is neither Catholic nor Puritan nor Christian in any other explicit sense. It is also not the somewhat idealized and consciously embraced artistic tradition that T.S. Eliot spoke of. It is more a living history, a pattern of thoughts and actions that individuals are born into. The word culture may be more precise here than the word tradition. In an essay reflecting on Southern culture in particular, O'Connor once said, "Good and evil appear to be joined in every culture at the spine." Sad, but as O'Connor sees it, true in our post-Lapsarian world. Good and evil may be joined at the spine in families in the same way, which we will consider as we look at O'Connor's story, A View of the Woods. But we should concisely revisit Hawthorne before doing so. We read O'Connor's essay, Introduction to a Memoir of Mary Ann, today in conjunction with this story, and I could say a good deal about Hawthorne's daughter, Rose, a convert to Catholicism, who has recently become a candidate for canonization. She is currently Servant of God, Rose Hawthorne. But I will focus for just a moment on Nathaniel Hawthorne's short story, The Birthmark, which O'Connor herself, of course, talks about. This story, The Birthmark, does not feature any Puritans with a capital P, but it does feature a Puritan with a lowercase p, the scientist Aylmer, who lives not in the colonial era, but in the late 18th century. Though there are many seemingly supernatural elements to this story, Aylmer is in effect an Enlightenment man, a figure of the age of reason. He has created in his mind a perfect type of the human body. You get the sense he'd really rather we not have bodies at all. But if we've got to have them, he's got his perfect type in mind. Unfortunately for his wife, she does not match this type, simply because she has a birthmark on her cheek, which Aylmer sees as, quote, a crimson stain upon the snow of her skin. So yes, it's red, just like the Scarlet Letter or the Red Cross. Aylmer soon selects this birthmark as, quote, the symbol of his wife's liability to sin, sorrow, decay, and death, end quote. Things don't go well from there. This is a mad scientist story. Aylmer becomes fixated on removing the birthmark and seems to think that if he can do so, he will not only purify his wife's skin, he will also hold the key to eliminating sorrow, decay, and death from all humanity. Again, he's not a Puritan with a capital P, but he does want to be in an essentially Edenic world, a prelapsarian world, and he believes that he can single-handedly engineer it. Aylmer is appropriately linked to a certain perfectionist or utopian tendency within the Enlightenment strand of American culture, whereas Hawthorne's colonial Puritans are clearly part of the Protestant Reformation strand. In either case, these Puritans, big P or little p, tend to emphasize entirely breaking with the past, perhaps all past human experience even, and starting anew. Hawthorne himself recognizes that this is neither possible nor desirable, and so it is that Aylmer, in the process of trying to remove the birthmark, ultimately ends up killing his wife, Georgiana. The simplest way to connect A View of the Woods with Hawthorne is to recognize that old Mark Fortune is Aylmer, and his granddaughter, Mary Fortune Pitts, is Georgiana. He increasingly sees her as imperfect, and in an attempt to correct her imperfection, he kills her. But there are many other elements to this story, which may be the most disturbing story O'Connor ever wrote, and that's a pretty high bar. I'm not going to pretend to be able to explain away all the disturbance. In teaching A View of the Woods, I in some ways find it best to present it as a kind of science fiction story, even a dystopian narrative like Huxley's Brave New World. Mark Fortune wants a future where everything is usefully organized, where there is no suffering, where everyone has physical comforts and conveniences readily available, and somehow feels free, but he senses that in order to do so, he has to get rid of the traditional family. Relatedly, his apparent love for Mary Fortune Pitts is ultimately not the natural love of a man for his grandchild. This apparent love is really a dominating desire to remake her in his own image. What he most likes about her is that she resembles him, but he wants her, in effect, to be a clone of him. Perhaps he could achieve this if only he could remove the Pitts blood, which, as he sees it, has tainted her like a birthmark, rendered her impure. This is a story which contains blood shed, of course, ultimately by Mark Fortune himself. Yet he doesn't much like blood, doesn't like color. Whenever Mary Fortune says anything that he considers nonsense, he says to her sarcastically, "And black is white." He does this on 2 different occasions. This is his way of asserting to her that, his way of asserting that, unlike her, he is a rational man and therefore sees things clearly. White is white and black is black, and everything is either black or white. When other colors present themselves to him in nature, he doesn't like them. At twilight, the woods appear, quote, to be raised in a pool of red light that gushed from the almost hidden sun setting behind them. They present him with an uncomfortable mystery which he had not apprehended before, as if someone were wounded behind the woods and the trees were bathed in blood, end quote. This image does at least 4 things. It alludes to the suffering that Mary Fortune endures at the hands of her father. It foreshadows her murder by Mark Fortune. It encourages, along with other passages, a Christological reading of the woods. And finally, I think it reflects O'Connor's understanding that in nature itself, there's no such thing as life without bloodshed. That's actually a quote from Cormac McCarthy. but it's very O'Connor-esque in some ways, and I think objectively true on many levels. Mark Fortune is offended by this and would rather remove the pit's blood and the blood-soaked woods, like the Red Cross or the icon on Parker's back. He would like a purer world without bloodshed, and ironically, finds himself ready to shed blood to try and achieve that. He would also like, I think, a purer world without difference. He has a vague belief in a world where men were created free and equal, but he implicitly envisions all real men as being essentially like himself. Hence his desire to make Mary Fortune into himself and to dominate, if not eradicate, his son-in-law and all the Pitts family, all the blood that seems foreign to Fortune. This is where the story becomes almost allegorical, and you have to wonder how there's going to be any natural reproduction in a world with only one bloodline. There won't be. Mark Fortune is implicitly committing suicide by killing Mary Fortune, who, we should note, is named for his own mother. Implicitly, Mark Fortune wants to make his granddaughter more masculine. He certainly wants to make her into an adult. Much as Julian thought that his mother was childish for living in the past, the world that her parents had handed to her, Mark Fortune sees Mary as stuck in her problematic family, perhaps in a tradition, obviously flawed here as it is, precisely because she is a child. By contrast, Mark Fortune, like Julian, sees himself as an adult, which for him means an absolutely autonomous individual. Paradoxically, Mark Fortune wants to force his granddaughter to be such an autonomous individual too, to declare her independence. His brand of individualism is clearly isolating, more and more so as the story goes on, and is bound up with a desire to control and finally eradicate difference. While he can throw a biblical reference or two at you, he is essentially self-righteous. Everyone must be just like me or be dominated. He feels that he is patriotic, but there's lots of unum and no e pluribus in his vision. I think one thing that the three O'Connor stories I have discussed so far, and I'm coming to the end here, but I think one thing the three O'Connor stories I've discussed so far suggest is that one must have a sense of community which entails some appreciation of difference in order to be able to recognize the value of individuals. If one is a radical individualist like Mark Fortune or Julian or even Sarah Ruth in her way, one cannot see other individuals, even though one may have an ideal type of individual, like Aylmer can't see his wife Georgiana by the end of his story. And the deepest form of community is, of course, one that also stretches back in time to include the dead. So I'm going to say just a few things about the displaced person. I don't want to unduly preempt the afternoon seminar discussion, so I'm going to keep my comments on this story short, mainly posing some questions and pointing out a couple of fairly obvious things maybe at the beginning. As in everything that rises must converge, racial segregation is, of course, crucial to the plot. But here, as with some of O'Connor's other stories that we haven't read, it's equally important that World War II and the Holocaust are very recent. It's an unusual story for O'Connor in that it's so clearly focused on a little economy in some ways, the displaced person. It's one of O'Connor's two longest stories. She, of course, wrote two short novels as well, but of her short stories, it's one of the longest. And in some ways, it's one of her most ambitious. At the same time, I think it's finally one of her least ambiguous, the displaced person. I think in some ways it's almost preachy. Christ was just another displaced person, Mrs. McIntyre says, and the priest doesn't disagree. This story, by the way, is in O'Connor's collection, A Good Man is Hard to Find. So the other three stories we've read for this weekend are in the collection, Everything That Rises Must Converge, and might be united thematically by that phrase in some way. But the displaced person is in O'Connor's collection, A Good Man is Hard to Find. And the displaced person himself is pretty much the only good man you can find in that entire collection. Lots of bad men visit women in those stories. What happens when a good man finally shows up? What's What's Hawthorne like in this story? I'm going to repeat some questions that are in your folder, but add a few more. Do the Americans here think they live in a city on a hill or something like that? What forms of purity are they obsessed with? What different forms of individualism or simply self-absorption manifest themselves here? How is this a story about bodies and the tension between living in your head versus seeing the natural world, which includes bodies? Is this a story about the body of Christ? If it is, then I think it's related to the way that it's a story about color. One thing that's true about color here is that the displaced person doesn't seem to see things in black and white. We're told this early on. But color is present in the story most obviously in the form of the peacock. O'Connor loved peacocks. Parker looks kind of like a peacock. And O'Connor owned and knew a lot about the actual birds. But she also knew that they were symbols in the early church. The peacock was a symbol in the early church. There was a belief in the ancient Mediterranean world that the flesh of peacocks did not decay, and they became associated with Christ's body, specifically with Christ's resurrected body, and relatedly with the church. And this is where I have to apologize for being puritanical in this lecture by having no images. Right, I've been just reading text at you here this whole time. If I had one image to show you, it would be a painting, and this is the last thing I'm going to say here. Maybe you can look it up on your phone before the next seminar. But this is a painting of Fra Angelico's Adoration of the Magi, Italian Renaissance. There's the manger, and the Holy Family, and the Magi, and a massive procession of people that are filing by the manger, people who, like the Magi, have traveled from distant lands, and they are coming together to pay homage to the Christ child. On top of the manger is a large peacock. I don't think Hawthorne's Puritans were much about this painting, but Hawthorne himself would, and O'Connor would probably paint her self-acknowledged American ancestor somewhere at the back of the procession. I'm going to end there. Thank you. Is it okay? Yep.
What do you make of Mark Fortune's mother, like, dying in childbirth for him? It almost seems like something of, like, at least in terms of the last of the Fortune family, other than his own daughters, who he seems to disdain pretty much, that this tradition is pretty much being wiped out. And I don't remember exactly what he says about it, but I don't know. That's my question.
Yeah. Good question. I don't have an exhaustive answer. In a way, I think what I'm going to do is to pose, in a way, another question. I tend to think about his mother and the death of his mother. Again, I don't do this with every O'Connor story. Like in Parker's Back, I don't think of the characters allegorically, but it lends itself to that. And so I tend to focus on how Mark Fortune's killing of Mary is in some roundabout way him killing his mother too. And I guess a question I would pose in relation to your question is, we can't know this, we'd have to speculate on this. If Mary Fortune grew up, right, if she lived to grow up, would Mark Fortune ever want to see her in childbirth? And my guess is not. And you could, sort of psychologize that and think back, well, it has to do with what happened to his mother. But I also think he just doesn't want to see Mary Fortune suffer, right? He doesn't want to see her undergo pain of any kind. And of course, right, in order to avoid her suffering and bloodshed, he ironically kills her at the end. So, does that sort of answer your question or give you a little bit of a different way to think about it? Yeah. Yeah, and of course, right, childbirth is part of the natural process of life, so it can be connected to questions about nature in the story, right? So I tend to think of it that way rather than, I don't think that Mark Fortune actually wants any descendants other than Mary herself, who he wants to be, again, a kind of clone of her. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about your reference of Tocqueville. So he suggests that democracies have a flattening effect on the culture and people, that it preserves them from extreme evil, but also prevents them from pursuing great goods. And both Hawthorne and O'Connor, in the way that you discuss the traditions that they're drawing from, are drawing from some very extreme evils, right? And have a very, not necessarily good, but a very rich thing to draw from. How is that tradition that the artist needs to draw from affected by this possible flattening and by living in a world that doesn't have that kind of rich extremes that both Hawthorne and O'Connor are working with?
Good question. I think that both, I guess one answer to your question may be that both are tending to write more extreme stories as a kind of, to counteract, right, the society that they are living in. They're writing against the society that they're living in a way. I mean, O'Connor talks about that, of course, very explicitly in The Fiction Writer and His Country, and she is honing in there on American culture at mid-20th century. Hawthorne, I mean, if we were to think about Hawthorne in his context, I do think he thinks he lives in an America where things are flattening generally, right? He thinks he lives in America where people increasingly don't have much of a sense of original sin. So, right, it's strange that this guy who's writing in the mid-1800s is writing the stories where on the one hand you can read and say, well, his Puritans, you could critique their theology, their emphasis on total depravity, and you could say Hawthorne doesn't like that. He's pushing it back against that to a degree. And I think he is to a degree. But at the same time, he's writing against other writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, who are kind of tending to just walk away from the whole doctrine of original sin. And yeah, maybe not all of those, I would say, are as flattening as others. But yeah, I think Hawthorne's doing that in his own time. And O'Connor says as much herself in The Fiction Writer and His Country. Just a...
Okay, well, I can project.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me finish one. I want to say, just to finish up my last response, Hawthorne himself did have a strong sense of something like original sin. So he was sort of out of step with his time in being that way. Yeah.
So, thank you. That was fascinating. I have a silly question. I'm aware of that story that Flannery reports about, a college professor asking about the meaning of black hat in a
Right.
story.
Right. Right.
So at risk of that, I've always wondered about this ever since I was 16. Reading A Good Man is hard to find, and the misfit wipes his glasses. And in this story, there's this, Marianne has her little spectacles, and they make her look just like her grandfather. And it just seems that if I'm safe enough based on Dr. Foss's talk last night, that all between vision and glasses and eyes, and maybe it's just because I forgot to put my contacts in. That she is
Well, I think there's a lot, there's a lot to say potentially in answer to your question. So I've been, again, moving around to the different seminar groups, and in the one I was in, right before we broke at the end of the last session, there was a lot of discussion of, taking the spectacles off before the fight, right, at the end, which, to be honest with you, I've never paid that much attention to. So I'm still learning things from that. I would say in A View of the Woods, there's definitely one of the central scenes in the story is where we have not only Mark Fortune looking into the woods, right, and seeing that bloody image at sunset that disturbs him so much, but then we see Mary Fortune looking into the woods, right, as if she saw someone there, or as if, right, it was a sight that she preferred to him, right? That's what gets him so angry. So, I don't know. And thinking about vision in A View of the Woods, what are the characters staring at? Those are the two passages that come to mind for me. So, good man is hard to find. Do you have a more particular question about the spectacles there, or? No. No? Oh, okay. Was there another question over here?
So in The Displaced Person, one of the characters is told to prophesy, and then she speaks. I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship for O'Connor between prophets and prophecy and artists. Are they the same thing, meant to be the same, or is there a difference between artistry and prophecy for O'Connor?
I think that she thinks the best artists will be prophets. I think Jerome did a good job of setting this up last night, right? I mean, I think that she thinks the best artists will be prophets because they will see the truth as clearly as we can see it, and therefore come close to speaking for God and communicating to us what reality is. So I think she thinks that's a high bar. Right? I think she would say there are lots of artists who aren't quite getting there, but that is what the artist should strive for. Now you're mentioning Mrs. Shortley, of course, made me think of something a little bit different, but this may be something that will come up in the discussion of The Displaced Person. You know, I think in O'Connor's fiction generally, right, if we look at her whole body of work, characters like Mrs. Shortley, who seem in many ways to be passionately religious and to mouth what they think is prophecy, I think in some stories those characters come close to speaking for O'Connor, and in some stories they are completely off. It varies somewhat from story to story. And you could look at her nonfiction where she talks about this. I mean, in her essay, The Catholic Novelist in the Protestant South, she praises many aspects of a Southern Protestantism that she saw in Georgia that is represented to some degree, maybe in a kind of exaggerated way, by a character like Mrs. Shortley. She recognizes, and she gave that talk to a Catholic audience at Georgetown, and she basically said, a lot of you people, a lot of you Yankee Catholics, right, are going to look at these Southern Protestants in my fiction, and you're going to think they're completely corrupted and off base. But they've got things going for us that we don't, at least in the pre-Vatican II church. They read the Bible a lot, right? So she talks about her characters being informed by the Bible, and the Bible being the basis for storytelling and so on. So it's not to say that Mrs. Shortley herself, right, is necessarily one of those prophetic figures. Sometimes a character like her can be prophetic, but sometimes maybe she's just living in her head. Right. Jerome, yeah.
I thought that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
I love thinking about the Hawthorne stuff in particular. I've read most of the stories that you talked about from Hawthorne. And the young Goodman Brown story, I hadn't really thought about that in connection with A Good Man Is Hard to Find, but the word good man is in both titles. And so now I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, yeah.
And it seems in both stories, part of the point is that the way in which we understand good, the good man, that often we misunderstand what it means to be good. And but I don't know. I'm wondering if you might have some thoughts just on O'Connor and Hawthorne with this idea of the good man from both stories, and ways in which O'Connor might be playing with some of those themes from Young Goodman Brown.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I haven't given it a lot of thought. There are scholars who have noted the connection between the two before, the good man thing. I do think, a student mentioned this to me the other day when we read Young Goodman Brown in a class I was teaching, right? There is no real positive representation of the good in Young Goodman Brown, right? So in a way, I guess the differences stand out to me more, right? There is no positive representation of goodness in Young Goodman Brown. It's just that Young Goodman Brown is naive. He assumes, again, his community is evil, and then he goes into the woods and finds out. He thinks they're good. He finds out that they're apparently evil. Now, the whole thing could be a dream, so what are we going to do with that? The one exception to what I just said is his wife, Faith, who, of course, he tends to see as just a symbol of faith. Never actually has a conversation with her about anything. So she's not fleshed out, right, as a good character. So we don't really get a fleshed out positive representation of good in a good man or in Young Goodman Brown. Whereas in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, we do in The Grandmother. So we get a good woman, right? In the vital last few paragraphs of the story, right? As O'Connor said, the story, A Good Man Is Hard to Find, wouldn't be worth writing if it were not for what the grandmother did. So I guess the contrast between the endings of the story is actually what stands out to me first. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. O'Gorman.
Yeah. Thank you.
So our next session starts at 1 o'clock, so you have a little bit of time to, I think, is that right on the schedule? Yeah, 1 o'clock. My group, which was supposed to be in the Gallagher room and went up to 211, will just stay in 211 in the afternoon. And everybody else back to their rooms they were in this morning. And then if, again, just come back here, we'll debrief a little bit and put the stuff away. So thank you.